Both topics I want to discuss with our next guest, Steven Woolfe. He's former MEP, of course, and director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. Good morning, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Julie.
I do that every time, don't I? I've just got no idea what time of day it is most of the day. It would appear these days.
It's an exciting day, that's why.
Is that what it is? Is that what it is? But anyway, look, let's talk first of all about where we are. We have this horrific deaths in the Channel, 12 people dying, 10 of them were women and children, or girls, a pregnant woman, 6 children among those dying. I mean, it's just absolutely horrific deaths and totally needless. There's now some reports that actually on this very rickety overloaded dinghy that one of the passengers actually may have deliberately, slashed the boat or something to make it sink so that they would get rescued and get to the other side, basically taken to the UK or quicker. But I mean, we've also got at the same time these urges, that we need to smash the gangs, clearly not working. But we also need to do a deal with the EU, particularly with France, on how we handle this. Now, the UK, the Home Office, has basically said that they will not do a deal with the French after they appealed to have an asylum treaty where basically we all take our fair share, in inverted commas, of asylum seekers across Europe, EU and the UK. Do you think that's the right decision?
Well, of course, it's the right decision at the moment for us not to take anyone that's coming across from France, because we're already going to take about 40,000 again this year, if not, and a little bit more when we talk about those who are coming off on the back of lorries too. That still goes on. Yeah. And whatever happens is, we've heard over the last few weeks that Keir Starmer says he wants to do a deal on immigration with Germany. Yeah. He wants to do a deal with Italy. What that really means is that he can't do a deal individually with each of those countries, Julia, because all of the immigration and asylum policies are driven out of the European Commission. All those countries have signed up to the Asylum and Immigration Pact. So they've got allocation processes. And what the French are trying to effectively say is, on their fair decision, is we'll give you more. Yeah. Because they actually get thousands more than we do every year, and the EU is looking to take somewhere around 1 million next year. So if we're going to take a fair proportion, I suspect as one of the top 4 countries, we'll take a huge proportion of that numbers if the French were going on. So it's the right decision. Absolutely.
One of the things I find extraordinary is when Keir Starmer was talking about this, doing these deals, and what he's trying to do is trying to persuade them to sort of, back me up when you go to Brussels on this, the influential, bigger economic countries. But again, when they were saying we're going to do a deal with France or deal with Germany, you just think, hold on a minute, we were told for years we couldn't do anything because we were in the EU, and then they suddenly changed their tune. And this is the reality. It's the EU that calls the shots on this one, and the EU bureaucracy is totally and utterly, completely controlled by this obsession over illegal migration and this idea that basically open borders, not just within the Schengen area, within the EU, but pretty much across the board. And we know there are many countries that are unhappy about that. The Eastern European countries are kicked off about it. We know Italy, Giorgia Meloni upset about it. And also, belatedly, Germany and indeed France finally realising that it's not what their voters want either, as they see the rise of Marine Le Pen in France, and of course, and the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, in Germany in recent elections, where voters are saying, we're not prepared to put up with this. But I tell you where I definitely don't want to have any asylum seekers and migrants from is Germany or France, given the spate of outrageously criminal terror, fatal terror attacks that we've seen in both of those countries in the last few years, carried out by asylum seekers.
And another one allegedly today has been faced with being shot.
In Munich.
In Munich. So what we do know is that the big attacks, the huge attacks that were taking place in Germany in particular, and to a lesser extent in France, have been caused by those who have claimed asylum. And what Germany and France are now facing, particularly in an economic downturn, and you've got to see how bad the downturn is in Germany, is that thousands of these people are unemployed, they're looking for jobs. I mean, OK, it's bad enough here in the UK that we've got 1.3 million asylum applicants of those who've gone through the asylum process who are economically inactive. But in Germany, it's well over 1 million as well, because they brought in millions. As the German corporate said, we needed lots more people to fill our car factories, to work in our engineering companies. Yeah. And now we're seeing them in a downturn having to get rid of companies, and even Volkswagen going to face a very large coup against the unions because they need to close down factories. And what this means now is the intensity of disruption in that country are caused by those large numbers of asylum applications unemployed.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing reflected in the polls, particularly in eastern Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, not unemployed, unemployable. And we saw that in Germany when 1 million people arrived after the Syrian civil war, 2015. And it turns out, at least 40% of them weren't actually from Syria, but that's what you could claim. And you could basically, Angela Merkel said, come on in, the water's lovely, you're all welcome to stay. Many of them moving on to countries like Sweden and trying to get to Britain. We closed the doors at that point, and thank God we did. But basically, it's a huge number of them, obviously not speaking German, but not learning German, living in completely parallel societies. The rate of crime, violent, sexual and acquisitive crime going up in areas where there have been large numbers of these people. And again, everyone gets very upset. I get Ofcom complaints when I state this. These are incontrovertible facts. They are there, contained in official criminal statistics from these countries, and it's happening across the board. And people get uncomfortable about talking about it. But again, you import a lot of people from countries with a completely different culture, completely different attitude to women, and completely different values. This is what happens, and I simply don't understand why people are shocked by this.
Well, the shocking element, I think, is what I'm now terming the kind of institutional ignorance of the impacts of immigration.
Yeah.
And what they do is it's very comfortable for chief executives of large corporations who live in beautiful areas and don't have to have the impact of the mass immigration in the poorest areas imposed upon them. And they're backed up by those who in the civil service, whose main aim is not to do too much, to ensure we just float along, don't have too many concerns. And lastly, certainly as because we're at dinner parties, we don't want to be called racist or xenophobic. Because we don't want our dinner parties cancelled. And so as a consequence of that, they lived in this cultural world of their own, which has ignored what's been happening for years and years and years. Yeah. The problem is now, with the mass economic issues beginning to impact GDP per capita, even those intellectuals who've been ignoring this now recognise that it's costing more to countries, both in what we're having to borrow to pay for public services, but also the lack of income coming in. There is no boom being caused by mass immigration.
Yeah. It turns out that someone from Eritrea turning up here with no qualifications, not speaking the language, isn't, funnily enough, going to become a top-rate taxpayer. I'm as surprised as you are about that, Stephen, but there we are. I want to come to, actually, the classic example of the great and the good and their views on this, Tony Blair, in a moment, but I just want to run this particular story by you. This is a story about Tom Roberts. He's a 21-year-old. He was an aspiring Marine. He was stabbed to death last year, he was stabbed to death before then, but he was a man was basically sentenced to life behind bars for his murder, 29 years behind bars in March 2022 following a trial. And this man was a violent Afghan asylum seeker. His name was Lawangin Abdulrahimzai. The inquest into, the reason it's in the news now is because the inquest into Tom Roberts' death has basically been, it's been ruled by the coroner as not being necessary. You don't have to have a full inquest into his death. He was stabbed to death because normally there's an inquest into violent deaths. But the inquest has heard that Lawangin Abdulrahimzai had previously shot 2 migrants with a Kalashnikov rifle in Serbia while he was travelling to the UK. He claimed to be fleeing the Taliban. He arrived in the UK and told Border Force officers he was 14. In fact, he was 19. He was placed in a secondary school in Bournemouth in Dorset. He was very soon expelled from that school because he carried a knife. He was then sent to another school in Bournemouth. Incredibly, he was flagged by the Home Office's Prevent Anti-Terrorism Task Group back in 2021 as being susceptible to terrorism. Yeah, do you think? And he later went on to murder Tom Roberts, stabbing him to death. It is absolutely extraordinary that someone like this was in the country, lied about who he was. We don't know whether he lied about where he was from as well. And yet he was allowed to go on and to kill somebody in cold blood. And kind of the authorities kind of just shrug and then carry on. But this is going to happen again, isn't it?
Well, it's happened before. I remember a soldier in the middle of the street in London, called Lee, I've forgotten his surname, I'm afraid, who was stabbed, clearly visible to lots of us. And we've watched some crimes occur from Manchester with the bombings in Manchester, which were carried out by those who'd come across and were monitored by our security services. So if we think it's not going to happen again, then you've got your head in the sands. And that goes to the point of view that I've been saying about the institutional ignorance by those people in our elites now, is that these are happening more and more frequently, not just in this country, but across Europe. And they're still saying, we can't do anything about it. We can't stop the boats. We can't prevent them coming in. We can't monitor them effectively. And so it's the public that will have to face the consequences and damages to their lives and their families. And that is why I say these people should look in the mirror and hang their heads in shame. If they're not willing to protect the people of this country properly, get out of the way, leave, retire, move somewhere else, allow somebody else that will do the job properly to take their place.
And also stop shouting bigot at anyone who raises facts. And opinion, but particularly when they're facts. Well, I'd love to know your thoughts on what Tony Blair's had to say. He was talking to BBC's Amol Rajan in an interview yesterday, where he was talking about, now this is legal migrants, but the influx of migrants under his premiership. We know 10 million people have come in the last 20 years, but the big influx began under Tony Blair when he basically opened up, where we were within the EU, the UK, to the Eastern European accession states, long before they were allowed to live and work in France, Germany and Italy, which meant we had a huge number of people arriving, admittedly, yes, to work. And many of those people have settled in here and are our neighbours and our colleagues and our friends and our family members now. However, that was a decision that opened the floodgates in terms of numbers. It has continued massively since then, massive impact, as you say, economically and on our public services, but also on communities in terms of strain. This is Sir Tony Blair, for the first time admitting, as far as I can tell, that their influx of migrants that began under his premiership did actually put a strain on communities. Here's what he had to say.
What I always say to people is this: I am very happy to take full responsibility for the more than 10 years that I was British Prime Minister and for the decisions I took. What I won't do is take responsibility for the time when I wasn't Prime Minister. The truth is, we did need a lot of people for the British economy coming in from Europe. However, if I'd still been in power, and I'd noticed, because this is true, in certain communities there was a big influx of people, it was causing real strains in some of those communities. I don't think it's the biggest problem on immigration, but I agree it was a problem. If I'd still been in power, I would have been all over it.
He'd have been all over it. What do you make of that, Steven Woolfe?
Well, isn't it nice to actually see him have a road to Damascene conversion by saying that some parts of immigration was a problem and he would have been all over it? He wouldn't have been all over it at all, because it would have been too embarrassing for him, as he is part of that institutional elite that doesn't want to be upset at dinner parties. There's no way that I could see Sherry Blair sitting there saying you're at dinner parties where your husband is regarded as a racist or for stopping people coming over. Absolutely not at all. It's all great to see it in hindsight. And he talks about just legal migration, but I looked at the numbers before I come onto the show today, Julia, just to see what the illegal asylum application in the 7 years from 2000 to 2007, 393,561 applications in 7 years. He wasn't all over it then. He would never be all over it now. It's just that he's trying to deflect from having his key responsibility in starting the chain of effects that's happening today.
Absolutely. Talking of the chain effects happening today, of course, you played a big role as a former Brexit Party MEP, Steven, and I just want to know your thoughts on Michel Barnier. He was, of course, the man tasked by the EU as their chief negotiator. And again, I mean, I want that guy negotiating my next pay packet. It's as simple as that. The guy is a very tough negotiator. He absolutely stuck to his ground. It was much better than some of the useless people we had at the beginning. Thank God we had David Frost near the end to try and salvage something from it. But extraordinarily, Michel Barnier is being considered by Emmanuel Macron as his possible new Prime Minister to break the deadlock after those snap elections left a huge big victory for Marine Le Pen's party. And I did say earlier, we were discussing it with Philip Ingram, we'll come to in a moment, I thought he was being lined up as a possible successor to him to stand as president. Got that completely wrong, having seen the copy now. It's as a possible new French Prime Minister. What would you make of that if we did have Michel Barnier in the Élysée Palace in Paris?
Well, I will say that I met Michel Barnier. I took him, if you remember, a gift of a presents with a number of senior business people and met him. And he was very affable, very
charming.
And very, very, very charming, but incredibly steely. And so I would say that as a French Prime Minister, he would do a good job. And I then had a regular, only 15 minutes, but once a month from 2016 to 19, where we discussed Brexit and what was happening in Britain. Where I do find it interesting about Michel Barnier, which will be a very fascinating point if he is appointed, is when he decided to run for the premiership a few years ago. Do you recall how he changed his view on immigration?
Yes, suddenly he was all for closed borders.
That we should have a closure of Schengen, the borders should be closed. So maybe that's that particular mindset that he's come to, that he might be able to persuade those on the right of the French politics to support him so that he becomes Prime Minister. Be very interesting, but woe betide us if we think Keir Starmer is going to get anything from this man whatsoever.
Absolutely. Steven Woolfe, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you joining us. Former MEP, Director at the Centre of Migration and Economic Prosperity.